Well, this session, we're going to start going into some depth on a couple areas, specifically offshore oil and gas exploration, and then onshore and offshore wind farms. And these are probably two of the biggest new issues that our region is looking at. So we've got a great panel here to talk really about three things. One, the opportunities we have with these projects, the risks we face, and then the timelines for these projects. So first I'm going to briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll jump into it. Immediately to my left is Brian O'Hara, is the president and founder of the Southeastern Wind Coalition. Next to him is Craig Poff, is director of business development for Iberdrola. Did I get it?
Yes, you did.
All right. Iberdrola Renewables, which is the second largest wind operator in the United States. Next is Andy Radford, is the senior policy advisor for offshore issues with the American Petroleum Institute. Next is, this one I'm not going to get. Next is Lisa Sciravinato. That's close. Is the co-director of the North Carolina Coastal Resources Law, Planning, and Policy Center at NC State. And on the end is, by the way, a change in our program. It was supposed to be Eddie Farr, but his daughter went into labor yesterday, so he opted to be with his daughter instead of us today. So filling in is Jeff Vorberger, is the Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for the National Ocean Industries Association, which works on offshore energy issues. If we could please welcome our panel with a round of applause. We're going to start off talking about the timeline for these projects. So I think first, Andy, if you could take 2 minutes and take us through just timeline, where are we right now in terms of offshore drilling initiatives?
Happy to do that. Thank you for having us here today and for the warm welcome. We're at a critical time right now in terms of the timeline for offshore development. The first thing that's happening and has happened is the prospect for seismic surveys off the coast of the Atlantic coast. Companies have started the permitting process for that. Probably going to take a year or more to get through that permitting process with the government. So hopefully we'll have some boats out in the water collecting seismic data next year. And the other decision that's in the process right now is the 5-year planning process. And that's the federal government's way of determining when and where lease sales will be held for the next 5-year period. In this case, it's 2017 to 2022. So the process for decisions that are going to be, the decisions made now will affect policies well down the road. So what we're expecting in the next few months is a draft proposed plan. It's the second in 3 or 4 steps that the government goes through in determining where to hold these lease sales. So we should see a plan early next year, and hopefully that plan will include the Atlantic. If it doesn't include the Atlantic, then there's no prospect for drilling offshore until at least 2022. So really we need to see the draft proposed plan have the Atlantic in there, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska and other areas that we're interested in developing. So.
Okay. If I could ask the same from one of the representatives from the wind industry to kind of just put in perspective where we are with wind development.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the land-based portion of it. We have presently, as an industry, about 61,000 megawatts of installed wind power capacity in the U.S. Our company is the second largest of those. And that is spread out as an industry across about 3/4 of the country. There's a large gap in the southeast. Really from Virginia south, you don't see any wind, but certainly in the rest of the country, it's there. Technology has been advancing where lower wind resources have really become economically viable and will continue to do so in the next few years. And about 5 years ago, we started looking very closely at North Carolina. And you don't have any yet. A couple years ago, I would have said that within the next 5 years, North Carolina could expect to see a number of large-scale, maybe 200-300 megawatt projects, several of those. But in recent years, there's been passage of House Bill 484 a siting permit bill, which was enacted last year, and really sent a signal to the industry, slow down, reconsider whether you want to do business in North Carolina, and that's unfortunate. There's a lot of opportunity economically, I think, from an energy security, providing fixed cost energy into North Carolina, and creating an industry here locally. And unfortunately, some of the signals that have been sent in the last couple of years have led to a slowdown in other developers. Our company has a project that's fully permitted, isn't subject to 484, which we would hope to build in the very near future. But we've seen the activity from other developers really slow and or disappear in the last year.
Specifically in North Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yeah, and I might just add, so as Craig said, on the land-based side, we're essentially ready today. I mean, we're ready to go. On the offshore side for wind energy, we're well into the process. So if you look nationally, we don't have any offshore wind turbines installed in the U.S. yet. We have about 20 years of operating history in Europe with offshore wind. So this is not new technology. We'll expect to see probably the first construction start in the U.S. next year on possibly up to 2 projects, one in Massachusetts and one in Rhode Island. And there are several other projects in the pipeline. Here in North Carolina and the Southeast, I think what we're likely to see, or what's possible to see, is we could see development begin with the right policy mechanisms in place to support it. We could see development begin on a demonstration scale project at some point in the relatively near future. The development timeline takes a while, so you're probably looking at closer to 2018 or so before you actually see steel in the water and turbines spinning. But so this is a longer term industry. There are actions that we can take today that sort of set us up for the opportunities that come with this industry, which are very, very large, especially here in the Southeast. And we're really on the beginning edge of this industry here in the U.S.
And take us through quickly a little bit the economics of onshore versus offshore. So I mean, it's still, economically, profit-wise, it's still a lot better to be onshore, but you're looking longer term. Is the offshore potential?
Yeah. So if you look at the recent contract history for land-based wind, you look at the contracts that have been signed in the last 3 years, and they've been dropping each year. Last year, the average contract price for land-based wind energy was 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And to put that into perspective, our retail rates are about 10 cents. Now you're comparing retail to wholesale, but 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour is competitive with everything. It's competitive with natural gas, it's competitive with nuclear, it's competitive with coal. So land-based wind is a cost-competitive, reliable, clean energy resource available today. Offshore wind, when you go offshore, the winds are stronger and steadier, but it's very expensive to do things offshore. So currently, the biggest challenge in offshore wind is the cost. And what the industry is focused on is bringing that cost down so that offshore wind, like land-based wind, can become a cost-competitive resource option.
Great, thank you. And again, by the way, as we're having this discussion, please text in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as you can. The cards are on your table where you should text questions to. On the end.
If I could make a point on the timelines.
Yeah.
With regard to offshore oil and gas. As Andy mentioned, this is a process and it takes a long time. In one word, that is the word long, and that's quite intentional, and it's mandated in law essentially. So there's consultation at every step of the way, whether that be in the seismic surveying phase that we're in right now, the decision of if, when, and where to hold lease sales, after that, if a lease sale is actually held, drilling, et cetera, et cetera. All along that way, there are multiple opportunities, multiple layers of input by the public, by states, governors, local elected officials, leaders, all stakeholder groups involved, so tourism, fishing, recreation, et cetera, et cetera. Point being that there seems to be a narrative out there at times, or a perception that this is strictly a federal call, that the states and the locals have no input, and you all are going to be steamrolled in this essentially. And I just want to make sure that perception does not take root. It's not the case. As I said, all of this input that you all will have and this area will have is mandated in law, and beyond that, it's the right thing to do. So.
Yeah, Lisa?
Yeah, that's a really good point that you brought up. A lot of this is, yes, there are going to be opportunities for the public and for state and local government to be involved, but we have to be ready for the conversation. I think summits like this are a great entree into that so people can become educated on this. And a lot of it is really it's continuing to pay attention. When are public meetings going to take place? Are there going to be robust policies in place at the state level so the state can be ready to give input and participate in the process? So the Coastal Zone Management Act, for instance, it provides the opportunity through its consistency provision for coastal states to be able to provide formal input on the process when there are going to be permits or leases issued. However, the state needs to have all of its ducks in a row so it can be there at the table as equal partners with the federal government to be able to make sure that North Carolina's voice is heard and that our interests are protected. So a lot of it is us being ready as well.
Okay. Well, Lisa, I'm going to stick with you, and you've got the hard part here. Lisa is our objective third-party source here, so I've asked her to give us a quick rundown, moving beyond kind of the basic timeline for these projects, and give us an overview for both for offshore drilling and for wind projects in terms of what are the overall opportunities for our region and what are the risks for our region.
Well, there's definitely room for a lot of both. So when you're thinking of opportunity, North Carolina, just like any other state, looks at it as obviously the potential for job creation, the potential to participate in the country becoming more energy independent, and things of that nature. But there are also a lot of other things to think about in terms of this as well, because North Carolina, over the past several decades, has built several industries on the coast: tourism, recreational fishing, commercial fishing, the boating industry, etc. And so a lot of this is how can offshore energy, how can that production offshore and the onshore infrastructure work with that? So there's always this, in the policy world, talking about conflicts of use and how everything is going to play together. So, do we want to site a wind turbine or a platform in an area that is good for beach quality sand, for beach nourishment for our beaches? Do we want to have turbines? Do we want to place them in areas where commercial fishermen like to fish? There are synergies with that as well, so they can work together. So it's a lot of it is thinking about how we want to balance that. Industries that provide billions of dollars of income to our state, and kind of really how offshore energy can play with that. And then also looking at how the infrastructure is going to play into it as well. So an entire infrastructure industry would have to be built in North Carolina to support it if any of this energy were to come onshore to our state versus Virginia versus South Carolina, and really looking at the play on that. Our coast, I don't need to tell anybody in this room, is a very dynamic system. It changes naturally. There are storms that can cause a lot of short-term erosion issues. And so how are we going to make sure that we build these in a good way that's going to take into account our environment? So in our changing coastal system. Because there's a lot that's going to have to be built, and to make sure, again, that is something that complements the industries that are already here. So these are a lot of things that North Carolina can think about. It's not just what's happening offshore, it's what could happen onshore as well, and what can we do to kind of, if North Carolina wants to nurture this industry, how do we nurture it in a way that also protects our current industry as well?
Great, thank you. Well, I think if the other panelists, let's put a little more perspective on the opportunity first here in terms of revenue sharing, which is one big discussion that's going to happen here. I don't know if it's for both industries or more particular for offshore drilling, but that's they can explain this in better detail. But with in different states and different projects, there's revenue sharing, whether that comes to the state, whether that comes to a local level, and of course the other the other opportunity is with job creation and new industry.
Well, I'll jump in, Rob, and speak about the particular project that I've been most involved in for the last 5 years in Pasquotank and Perquimans County in northeastern North Carolina. We have a 300 megawatt project that would create somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 permanent jobs, which doesn't sound like a lot, isn't a lot. But over the course of construction, there'd be several hundred for a couple years of construction cycle. Once the project is built, about $1 million in tax revenue per year paid to the two counties. Very low per capita income up in that part of the state, as you can imagine. And it's an agricultural land use. So as a taxpayer, our tax bill would equal, I think, the next 8 or 10 largest taxpayers in each county. And then, of course, royalty payments to landowners. All of this is on private land, and about $1 million a year goes to the farming and silviculture, the folks that own and operate that land. So North Carolina Commerce did a report that indicated in the neighborhood of $400 million net economic impact to the state of North Carolina for that sort of project. So we feel very good that in these rural areas without a lot of other opportunity, that here's a use that doesn't put a lot of burden on existing infrastructure, no schools, water, sewer, police, fire, those sorts of things don't really come into play. So the economic benefits really fall to the bottom line in those communities.
And I can talk a little bit about oil and gas and the revenue sharing program that's in place in the Gulf of Mexico. It's in effect for 4 states in the Gulf, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. And those states share 37.5% of all the federal revenue that's generated from offshore leases. Currently, it's in just a small area, but in 2017, that'll be the entire Gulf. So it's a big windfall for those states. Potential for up to $500 million per year to be split up between those states. There's currently legislation that's been proposed in the Senate by Senators Murkowski and Landrieu to expand that to all states, and it would cover both oil and gas and offshore wind and other renewables that were generated. But it would provide for money to come to the Atlantic coastal states and other states that support offshore drilling. And our projections show that could mean between 2017 and 2035, as much as $4 billion could come to the state of North Carolina from that revenue sharing. And maybe Jeff can talk a little bit about the politics involved with getting that passed. I think that's kind of an interesting topic.
It is, Andy. There are, as Jack alluded to earlier, the issue around revenue sharing accruing to coastal states quickly gets very complicated, and in large part it's a regional issue. As you can imagine, there are some who come from onshore inland areas who are philosophically opposed. There is criticism that is thrown back and forth at those folks that, well, the federal land on your state onshore receives a 50% revenue share, so how dare you tell me from the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic Coast that I should not also enjoy those same benefits? So unfortunately, it's one of those issues in Washington where you see the dialogue and the debate deteriorates at times, but on the whole, there is a bipartisan consensus that this is the right thing to do. Certainly from NOIA's perspective and API's, I think, Andy, it's the right thing to do. It's a fairness issue. A number of times the House has enacted legislation to get this done, and the Senate just have not been able to get it over the goal line yet. But we're optimistic. But I would also just make the point that in addition to these tangible benefits, we've talked a lot about jobs, investment, revenue, and the jobs are measured in the tens of thousands. The revenue and the investment is measured in the billions of dollars, and that's obviously wonderful. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and say that's the reason that we want to have this conversation. One of the other benefits is that it enables locales to diversify their economy. And we've seen this in the Gulf, where you have multiple industries, ocean users, coexisting peacefully. So I mentioned earlier fishing, tourism, energy, military training exercise. And so all of these entities over the decades, over the years, have come together and realized that they're not adversaries. To the contrary, they're partners. And that it's a big ocean out there, and we can do all of these activities well. We can do them in a way that is environmentally friendly and that fosters a growing economy.
Lisa?
And I would just like to add to that, before I moved to North Carolina, I lived in Louisiana, and you could definitely see just really at work how the synergies that were there for the offshore oil industry and the fishing industry. So a lot of these platforms are great areas for fish, where they like to have for their habitat, and so they're really good. They're really rich, diverse habitats. There are a lot of fish that can be caught, and both industries have had a very good relationship and a very positive relationship. So you're right, you need to look at this in terms of synergies, how the industries can complement one another, because it can be done.
So I'd like to add, it's interesting, offshore structures in general become sort of fishing destinations, more so for recreational fishermen than commercial fishermen. But, Craig sort of touched on the impacts of one specific project locally in North Carolina. But if you look at more broadly the industry, the wind industry impact in North Carolina, there's a really good story to tell. I mean, Craig rightly pointed out we don't have any land-based wind installed in the southeast yet, but if you look at a map of where the supply chain and the manufacturing operations are for the wind industry nationally, there's a very strong presence here in the southeast. And that's because we are an attractive place to do business. We have attractive labor pool, highly skilled labor pool, low cost of living. And just a couple specific examples of that. Nucor Steel is a very big steel company you all probably know of, based here in North Carolina. They have a plant in Hertford on the coast that provides between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the plate steel for the U.S. wind industry for welding steel towers. PPG Industries is a fiberglass manufacturer that makes fiberglass for wind turbine blades. And then in the offshore side, you look ahead, and what's motivating a lot of the states up in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast to be fairly aggressive in the offshore industry is that they've seen what happened in the land-based industry. They see that where initially we were importing products from Europe, and it just makes economic sense for the supply chain to grow up here once the industry's here. So that's going to happen on the East Coast with the supply chain of the offshore wind industry. Once we see a pipeline of projects, there are going to be coastal manufacturing facilities, and these need to be coastal with water access because the size of these components are too large to travel on roads, too large to travel on rail lines, so you need coastal access. So coastal communities, especially those with good port facilities, are very well positioned to attract major manufacturing to support an entire East Coast industry. And I think it takes a little bit of vision and a little bit of leadership to say, we're going to do the initial steps that we need to do to become that destination for those jobs. Yeah, so this area, I think if you look up and down the coast, each area sort of has its strengths. And one of the things that we're working on right now is sort of mapping the supply chain assets in the wind industry throughout the region. And we're not done with that yet, but I suspect one of the things that we'll find is that because there's a lot of experience here in sort of boat building industry, we've got a very strong port in this area, blade manufacturing could be a really interesting play for the Wilmington area that could supply wind turbine blades up and down the coast. Wilmington Port is a very good port for offshore wind energy activities. But I think the key is, all of the states see this opportunity along the East Coast. The key is to show the industry some signal that, look, we're interested, there's a future for this industry here, because if the industry believes that all of the development is going to happen in Massachusetts and New Jersey, it's going to be much harder to attract that sort of hub status down here. So I think we need to show a path. That doesn't mean we need to go develop 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind tomorrow, but we need to show a path of why we're in this game.
And just to add to that, Brian, the development, be it probably oil and gas or wind or any other business, it's all about managing risk. And we look for signals that indicate sound investments, risky investments. And 5 years ago, North Carolina had recently passed Senate Bill 3, establishing the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Had a really attractive tax credit at the state level. And really had communities that were looking for investment. And you saw it work. You saw developers attracted, spending millions of dollars to develop projects, leasing land, doing studies, all sorts of preparatory work for these projects. They take 3 to 5 years to develop. And then a couple years ago, there was some concern about military conflicts. And the reaction to that manifested itself in legislation about state siting. And the signal to the industry is playing out. You see that going away. And the reality is military conflicts, if I can speak just to that issue for a moment, wind, I'm sure offshore oil and gas and certainly offshore wind, there is a mechanism set up within the Department of Defense to vet these sorts of potential conflicts. It works very well. And yet North Carolina didn't trust that and ended up with a bill that really sent a sour signal to the industry. And so I think if North Carolina wants to attract investment, which will lead to investment and more, manufacturing jobs, other sorts of jobs around the industry, really got to send a better signal than what's being sent now, because there are plenty of states out there that are sending signals to come invest here. And whenever one can invest a dollar that's risky and a signal's being sent that this isn't a good investment or risky investment, and you can deploy that capital elsewhere where it's a more welcoming atmosphere, it's not too tough of a calculation where you want to go.
A lot of attention, obviously, and rightfully so on this issue right now. As Andy mentioned earlier, the federal government recently issued the guidelines. Essentially, these are the rules by which seismic operators are able to go apply for permits. And so that permitting application process is ongoing right now. And there are, as I mentioned, the first point to make is that there's ample opportunity, public input. There's a very robust environmental review process along the way. There are a number of mitigation measures, in terms of when you actually get the boats in the water and you go out there and you conduct the surveys. There are a number of mitigation measures that are taken to protect marine life, protect the environment. Quick examples. You have to have what is called a marine mammal observer on the vessel at all times. If you see an animal come into the safe zone, as it were, shut down operations immediately, not allowed to restart until the animal leaves the area. You have what they call ramp up and ramp down. So it's not as if you flip the switch and you're on full bore, right? You start slowly and you literally ramp up. It acts as a signal to any marine life to leave the area. But at its core, at its core, and where you should start with that answer is that seismic is a ultrasound of the Earth. That's essentially what it is. It is an information gathering technique to make sure that we arm ourselves with the best data available so that we can make informed decisions going forward. As was mentioned earlier by Jack, it's been 30-some years since we've had the opportunity to accumulate this data here in the Atlantic. So it seems extremely difficult to base future decisions on leasing if you don't have that information in hand. Seismic has been conducted around the world for 60 years or so without a single scientifically documented instance of harm to marine life. It's a wonderful track record, and it can be done the right way.
And I think just to add to that, it's important to note that the government's, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, their chief environmental officer, Bill Brown, Dr. Bill Brown, said is quoted as saying that the effects of noise have been wildly exaggerated by the opponents of oil and gas, and it's wildly exaggerated and not supported by the facts, and that's really the truth.
Well, let's spend a little more time on potential risks for oil and gas. I mean, there's basically two broad categories. I mean, besides seismic testing, obviously there's the issue of potential spills, and then there's the aesthetics issue, which is potentially for both oil and gas and wind. I mean, Jack addressed some before in terms of the risk of spills, but if you could first address that. And then also, there's a lot of questions on the aesthetics. So we're sitting at Wrightsville Beach, we look out, there starts to be offshore drilling, off our coast. What are we going to see? And then we'll turn to the wind side for that also.
Well, I would say for offshore oil and gas, you'll likely won't see anything. It's going to be well offshore. If you're standing on the beach, the most you can see out is probably about 3 miles or so. If you're on a high-rise hotel, which there's a few on the coast there at Wrightsville Beach, I know, you can probably see out to about 15 miles. Now, the areas we're looking at are probably, 40 miles out and beyond, I think, is probably the areas that we think the geological potential is. So from an aesthetics point, you won't see anything. In terms of, to build on some of the things that Jack said earlier about some of the things we've done since the Macondo incident to improve our safety, improve our performance, we've really beefed up our industry standards in terms of well design. We issued new guidelines on how to drill wells in deep water. We issued new guidelines on how to properly cement wells. We issued new, and then we've done a lot of work in terms of intervention, in terms of if there were an incident such that happened in the Gulf, we now have technologies. The Marine Well Containment Company and Helix have devices that can be deployed, so the duration of the event would be much shorter, and these we could control that type of event, but we really put a lot of effort into the prevention side. And also, Jack mentioned the Center for Offshore Safety, which is a forum for companies to come together to really discuss safety and how to improve the safety culture within the industry through sharing best practices and learning from incidents that might take place. So, Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Rob, at the risk of offering you a philosophical answer to that, I guess. Perceived risk is largely built on fear of the new, fear of the unknown. As I mentioned earlier, the offshore oil and gas industry is one that has been operating not only in the Gulf of Mexico, but around the world for 60-some years. So the technologies out there, while they're advancing, they're not new. They've evolved over time, obviously, to improve safety, to make sure that we have a safe workforce, a healthy workforce, and a clean ocean. But it's certainly new here, and it's new in the Atlantic, and we recognize that. So there are understandably very legitimate concerns and questions being raised that demand answers. And so that's why opportunities like this are so wonderful, so that we can have that conversation, as was mentioned earlier. And we just want to make sure that conversation is had on a foundation of science, facts, and reasonableness, as opposed to hyperbole. And unfortunately, some of the dialogue that's out there right now ebbs toward the irrational. And so we're here to answer those types of questions, as Andy just did, and make sure that those decisions that we're making in the future are based off of the facts. And whatever that answer is ultimately, yes or no, maybe, that is based on the facts. And that's all we're asking, essentially.
So from the wind perspective?
Yeah, so from the wind side of things, I think I know what we're going to see is we won't see development proposed within 10 miles of the coast. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has sort of designated some areas, and the closest ones to the coast currently are 10 miles offshore. At a distance of 10 to 15 miles with perfect visibility, meaning no haze, an offshore wind turbine, if you stuck your arm out in front of your face, would be about the size of your pinky nail on the horizon. But the reality is, atmospheric conditions actually have more to do with whether or not you're going to see them than the distance to shore does. So again, at a sort of 10 to 15 mile range, BOEM actually did a scientific study on this, sort of simulating the visual conditions, and it was a fraction of the days in the summer because of the haze that you would actually see them at all during the day. So visual impacts it's an important discussion, but it's one that really needs to be based on sort of understanding. And what I wish is that we had some installed capacity here in the U.S. where folks could actually go and see it, because I think once we have that, that becomes much less of an issue. There's actually an interesting story, and you probably heard, if you've ever followed offshore wind, you've heard of the Cape Wind project in Massachusetts, and that project has undergone years of legal challenges. And I like to say that it's a project that was proposed in a really excellent technical location, but a really bad political location. I mean, it's essentially in the Kennedy's front yard in Nantucket Sound. And that project's going to get built, but you've seen sort of the evolution of opinions around that, and folks that were initially saying no, we don't want to see this, and then learned more and said, okay, it's not that big a deal. There was actually a ferry company that initially opposed the project, saying this is going to be a big problem for us. Our ferries are going to, these turbines are going to be in the way of our ferries. And then a few years ago, they changed their tune and are supporting the project and announced they're going to be offering ferry tours out to the turbines once it gets built. So, the impacts on tourism can be positive as well.
And with onshore, it's really a function of where you put wind projects. I think there have been some very good lessons learned in the last 30 or 40 years. Most of the horror stories that are recycled again and again and again about avian impacts or eagle deaths or this or that are primarily from old projects. Small, fast-turning turbines in mountain passes in California that are home to raptors. And we simply don't build those sorts of turbines any longer in the industry, nor do we put them in those sorts of locations. We spend a lot of time examining the ecological environment before we would build a project. Companies like ours who it's our business to own and operate these over long term hate risk, and so we avoid any place where you can have these environmental risks, be they a bird or a bat or a bunny, whatever, or a community that doesn't welcome you. And so these all really need to be managed. And a catastrophic failure of a wind turbine results in a wind turbine not working. It doesn't have a ripple effect. And the other beauty of wind from an impact perspective is both environmental and economic. Unlike a lot of conventional generation, we can predict the cost of our fuel with 100% certainty for the life of our project. The wind is always, as it will be in the future, today it's free. And we aren't subject to volatility. And so those sorts of things, I really think a properly sited project, you can mitigate those impacts to the community, you can control risk, and you have neither the economic or the environmental impacts that go on for the life of a project.
There is currently offshore production off the coast of California. There hasn't been any new drilling in that area in a number of years. Realistically, the communities or the states have not been receptive to offshore oil and gas leasing. There's production in state waters in California, but there's no new drilling. So the political realities are that there's going to be probably no opportunities for drilling in the future in that area in the near future. Here along the Atlantic coast, the reason for industry interest is because the elected officials in these states, it's bipartisan up and down the coast. In Virginia, you have the senators, the governors, North Carolina, you have the governor very supportive. South Carolina, you have very supportive. And as they were mentioning on the wind side, the industry looks for signals where the communities are receptive. So that's the reason there's interest in the Atlantic at this time. So.
Yeah, it's a good question. It actually points to a real strength of North Carolina and of the Southeast because, as you said, the continental shelf slopes much more gradually down here. It allows us to be much further offshore, yet still be in what the industry defines as shallow water, which I would say is less than about 110 feet or so. And really, so there are two additional costs as you go further offshore, assuming that you're getting into deeper water. One, your foundation structure changes somewhat, but really at 30 meters or 110 feet or below, it's a very marginal cost. So it's almost a rounding error. The other additional cost is the additional cost of the transmission cable, which is not insignificant. You're talking probably $3 million a mile to install a transmission cable offshore. But in the context of a larger project, that's typically what you're doing is offsetting that by greater wind energy production. So as you move further offshore, the wind gets stronger and steadier, and this is true in land-based and offshore, marginal increases in wind speed, in average wind speed, have a significant impact on the revenue side of your project, and that's typically way more than offsets the additional cost of transmission. So there's a sweet spot. There's also an additional cost of the transit time for operations and maintenance vessels to get back and forth to the turbines. So typically there's sort of an optimization that's done between getting out into the good wind, but balancing those additional costs with that additional revenue. So I think that's likely to be 10 to 20 miles offshore, perhaps even further as technology improves.
That's a very good question. I mean, that's one of the very common questions I get hit when I'm down here. So turbines turn out to be very smart machines. Not only do they point themselves into the wind, they adjust their blades to optimize their output based on the wind speed. And they have an operating range. A modern turbine will begin turning around, let's say, 8 or 10 miles per hour of wind speed up at the hub, so 300 or so feet off the ground. And then around 50 miles an hour will literally turn their blades to feather into the wind and stop rotating. Now they will continue to sense the wind direction and stay pointed into it in those sorts of storm situations. And for hurricane purposes, we spend a lot of time worrying about the weather in our business. So we do long-term analytics over what we can expect. I mean, that's essentially where we're going to earn our revenue. But there's also a point where catastrophic weather events can cause big problems. And so we go to great lengths to engineer the foundations, the specification of the turbine itself to withstand those sorts of events. And I should say that while hurricanes are certainly large, powerful storms that can cause great amounts of damage, we also have projects in the Midwest that are subject to tornadoes, which have higher wind speeds on a much smaller basis. But the designs, the operation, and the technology itself, it is made to be out in the environment. And certainly here in North Carolina, it's a consideration and one that's taken very seriously. And we've certainly addressed that in the design of our project and the way we build it. You want to speak to offshore?
Yeah, well, first I'll just give you an example. I mean, the most recent hurricane experience we have on the East Coast is Sandy, kind of running up the coast. And the track record of wind energy in Hurricane Sandy was very good. And all of the coastal wind farms remained operational following Hurricane Sandy. In many ways, providing electricity when some other plants were down. It's actually usually the grid being down that prevents them from providing the electricity. So there is a good track record. Current offshore wind, most of it is installed in the North Sea, and if you've ever been to the North Sea, you know it's not pleasant weather over there. Now that said, that's not hurricanes, and it's a whole different type of weather event, and the industry is looking very closely at hurricanes. The current turbines are designed currently to withstand up to about a Category 3 hurricane, a full Category 3 hurricane. There's a new design class coming out called they're calling it a Typhoon class wind turbine, which is designed for the Asian market that is even more resilient. And I actually started my career in the offshore oil and gas industry, and I can tell you that there isn't much that man builds that does well in a Category 5 hurricane. So at some point there becomes a balance between engineering solutions and insurance risk mitigation solutions. And we get this question all the time as well, and I can tell you in talking to turbine manufacturers, insurance providers, and anyone else involved in this, there is no one in the industry that believes hurricanes are a showstopper. Challenge, yes. Showstopper, no.
Well, we have to wrap up this panel. Most of the panel is going to be here the rest of the day, so if you have other questions, if you could please find them and talk to them individually. If we could please have a round of applause for all of them coming to town today.